Hello, Sublation viewers. Welcome to a special episode of the Cutrone Zone, where I will be playing a different role than usual. I will be the host of the show, and I have a guest this week, Edward Remus. Ed, would you like to introduce yourself, and then we can talk about what we're going to discuss on the show?
Thanks, Chris. Yes, I have a few different roles. I'm an editor at Sublation, a longtime member of the Platypus Affiliated Society, and also a founding member of the Campaign for a Socialist Party. And for my day job, I'm also an associate professor and social sciences librarian.
Great. Cool. So I asked Ed to come on the show this week to discuss his article in Compact Magazine on the Charlie Kirk assassination. And the title of the article, which we will link in the description of the video, is Charlie Kirk and the New Civil War. So Ed, if you'd like to introduce the article and what motivated you and what you were thinking about generally, how you were reacting to events and trying to write the article.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the motivation comes from a few different directions. But I suppose at core, I go back to your Why Not Trump article. And that has kind of charted a course in the sense that I think it's charted a course in platypus and for platypus around an entire set of ideological pitfalls that has unfolded across the entire past decade. And I suppose I don't have, I don't claim that my article does anything quite so grandiose or ambitious, but it's an attempt to think about, if that's the sort of intellectual and political framework that we needed for the past 10 years, what framework are we going to need for the next 10 years? Like, what could be coming around the bend that could actually be surprising and confusing and disorienting politically for leftists, and including for those of us in the platypus or sublation milieu who look to a kind of independent party political left politics as the historical horizon of the left and a potential future horizon also that we might recapture. From that point of view, what could happen, at least in capitalist politics, that might be quite profoundly disorienting and confusing? And in that sense, I think if the past 10 years were essentially about Trump's hostile takeover of the Republican Party to effect a kind of very profound and conflicted shift in US and global politics, post-neoliberalism, it seems possible to me that there could be some kind of shift in the Democratic Party to come. Now, of course, the timing of that is unknown. It remains to be seen. We have some historical precedents, like the Republican Party after the New Deal or the Democratic Party after Reagan. There are Nixon-Reagan. We have some precedents of what a realignment of this kind looks like. We don't know exactly when it could be said to have happened definitively. But let me put it another way. This is my first time trying my hand at a kind of popular political journalism style of writing. And the piece that I actually discussed with you some time ago that I thought of writing kind of in a playful spirit, and maybe who knows, maybe I'll pitch this to Compact someday, or maybe one of our viewers will go off and write it, and that would be just fine. But it would be titled "Donald Trump May Die a Democrat." Mm-hmm. In other words, what, like assuming he lives a good long life, what might Donald Trump's party political preferences and even voting behavior be in 10 years? That's kind of an interesting question, right? So I would say that I've had that article in the back of my mind as something that I wanted to write and wanted to research, essentially Donald Trump's lifelong relationship to the Democratic Party. And then the Kirk assassination happened. And I was actually tipped off by a fellow Sublation editor, Wyatt Verlin, who has moved around politically quite a lot over the past few years, but he now, I believe, identifies as a Democrat. And
Right.
and he pointed me to this interview that Gavin Newsom, that Democratic Party Governor Gavin Newsom of California, did with Charlie Kirk, which was actually the very first episode of the podcast that Newsom launched in March of this year. And I think a distinctive feature of that period, of I would argue still our present period, that's what my article tries to bear out, but in particular the early months of this year, was that like the Democrats were still sort of reeling from the Kamala Harris loss. And I think much has perhaps happened in early 2017, you've pointed to this, that there was a period when Democrats were rethinking. They were saying,
Hmm.
we lost, we need to do some rethinking. And
Hmm.
obviously the rethinking circa 2017 was not particularly profound. And the resistance style politics within the Democratic Party just seemed to ride roughshod in the long arc of history between then and now over whatever alternatives the party might have had, kind of internally, politically, rhetorically, and or even organizationally, and so on. Um, but there were those who were within the party who were sort of prompting a rethink, and it really struck me that the person Gavin Newsom invited on, to his podcast in that moment to help him do a rethink about the orientation of the Democratic Party was Charlie Kirk. And so I sort of realized that in all the commentary on Kirk, there's been quite a lot about his life and his legacy. Um, Kirk's thoughts about the Democratic Party, especially as they unfolded in that interview, were not really given pride of place. But I would argue, from a, this could be wrong, but from a realignment perspective,
Hmm.
much as Trump's own legacy may be in the realignment of the Democratic Party, perhaps Kirk's own will be. And I think it's clear in that interview that Kirk himself was conscious of this. Something that didn't appear in my article, was that there was a great moment in that interview. I had it in the original version. It was taken out. The editors did a good job. They have to cut things down. But something I kind of wish had been retained in my article was there's actually a moment um, when Newsom essentially asks Kirk, do you predict just the kind of ultimate sweep and triumph of the GOP? Like, we're just declining and done as a party. And Kirk says, no, not at all. I don't have that kind of pride. I don't have that kind of confidence. We could mess up and you guys could adapt or change. And Newsom says almost simultaneously, we could adapt or change. And
Yep.
so it's clear that in the long arc, there are voices in the party, not even no less significant than a kind of party intellectual like Ezra Klein, but even a governor who's commonly acknowledged, at least as of this year, to be a potential frontrunner for their presidential candidate in 2028, who are acknowledging the possibility that the party could adjust or adapt to the kind of Trumpified.
Yeah, they did take it out. They
Yeah,
did take
yeah,
it out of the essay,
yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah. Indeed, but so I think uh, I felt that these are some important considerations, sort of in setting the table for the next 10 to 15 years. And to stretch that analogy, sometimes the meal isn't eaten until hours after the table is set. Sometimes appetizers aren't even served, until hours after the table is set. So I, later on we'll get into some criticisms that I've gotten from friends and colleagues about the article, but I will say, one of them pertains to timing, evidence and timing. Um, and so I would say that my article was really an exercise in thinking directionally, which sometimes goes a little bit against the grain of very rigorously evidenced argumentation. Right. But thinking directionally, meaning what might be only dimly perceptible now but could become much more significant and apparent later on. And
That's right.
could I conduct like a kind of thought experiment and prompt my readers to think, what if this thing, which you can kind of see now, there are some traces of it and glimmers of evidence, what if this becomes more significant? What if we all devote a little part of our minds to just keeping track of this little thing that's just starting to happen now? And with the possibility that it could become more significant. And if it does, again, we don't want to be politically blindsided and turned around by it. Namely, a kind of real, a MAGA, if you will, realignment to at least some degree, to whether consciously or unconsciously, of the Democratic Party itself. So yeah, sorry if that's a little
No,
bit
that's
long.
good. No, it's good. I mean, so yes, I would say that we've been thinking, for 10 years now about, the real effect of Trump is going to be on the Democratic Party.
Yes.
And that will take some time. So we have as a precedent the idea that the culmination of neoliberalism was really had under Bill Clinton. It's his election in 1992. It's his policies, which, by the way, uh, caused Trump's first defection from the Democratic Party, was around that election. And his disappointment with Bill Clinton was that Bill Clinton went for NAFTA, even though he ran against it. So that's one example from American politics. Also, famously, Margaret Thatcher said that her greatest achievement was Tony Blair,
Yeah, exactly.
meaning the neoliberalization of the Labour Party.
Right. Right.
But in both cases, it took, you know, 12 years
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
to happen.
Right.
12 or more years for that to happen. And so we will be at the end of Trump's second term at the 12-year mark. However, the Democrats might have avoided their reckoning in the Biden years, whereas now it's sort of unavoidable. So let's
Hmm.
one of the zingers in your article, one of the call out lines in the compact piece is the bullet that forever silenced Charlie Kirk was aimed at Gavin Newsom by proxy.
And let everyone know that is actually your line.
Oh, indeed, right. When we were talking about it,
I shared a draft. I shared a draft with you, and yeah, you encouraged me to add in some singers, and that is a great one, and it captures the argument perfectly. So thank you for that. Let it be known
right.
that is yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that came out of our conversation. And
Hmm.
in terms of just sort of bringing it home, and
Yeah.
I think that that's the difficulty is that, part of what your argument is that the polarization, the partisanship masks something else going on.
Yes.
In other words, the insistence that something like the Charlie Kirk assassination might be the result of excessive partisanship and party polarization is actually covering up the fact that there's a change and division afoot within the Democratic Party, and that was also seen in the initial Democratic Party, you point this out, projection onto the Republicans that Charlie Kirk's assassin must have been a far right wing person who didn't think that Kirk was right wing enough,
Hmm.
right? A groiper. Uh,
Right.
there are all sorts of counterintuitive conspiracy theories. So conspiracy theories have their charm in their counterintuitive character. But I think that you're not making a counterintuitive argument. You're more speaking what is known but unacknowledged, right? So that there is. Now, one thing that I wanted to say in terms of our conversation today is, well, what about the fact that the losing side in any election or in any battle uh, always has internal recriminations, meaning there's always a search for blame as to why the loss took place. So whenever a side loses in a conflict, such as in the 2024 election, it's natural for people on the losing side to search for blame. And that, given the general conservative character of American politics, of course, the blame is going to plausibly be laid at the foot of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Now, again, it's been a while now since Trump was elected for his first term, but there was something about that going on back then.
Hmm.
Meaning, was Trump a backlash against Obama? Was Obama too progressive? And is the danger, therefore, that Trump will be used as the excuse for the Democrats to become more conservative? Now, again, the onrush of events have caused us to forget these things. So we tend to forget the fact that Obama's second term was severely disappointing for progressives because it was when it was clear that he wasn't going to deliver on any of his progressive promises of the 2008 election that became clear in the second term, meaning you could excuse his failure to do so in the first term because he might be concerned about getting reelected. But in the
Hmm.
second term, when he doesn't have to worry about reelection, still he maintained the war on terror, he kept up the neoliberal policies, and also, despite measures that his administration did take, we had the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements emerging as expressions of disappointment in Obama, right? So Title IX expansion wasn't good enough, and so we needed the Me Too movement. And Obama being the first black president and having a kind of, very deliberate anti-racist policy wasn't good enough, and so we had Black Lives Matter. So, and then that seemed to have been forestalled by the Biden election in the sense of Biden being the most progressive president since LBJ. This kind of talk, I think Bhaskar Sankara of the DSA said so at the time. He said Biden is the most progressive president since LBJ, but that's not saying much, right? But still making that claim.
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
And so I think that again, this kind of, I don't know, Overton window kind of idea of the dynamics of party politics and partisanship tends to mask something else, which is post-neoliberalism.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right. But I do think that, we have to sort of maybe address, well, isn't it natural that the Democrats would be divided now in the face of a Trump victory? And after all, Kamala Harris's book that was just released, her her book on her campaign, is
Hmm.
indeed blaming a lot of people in the Democratic Party.
Hmm.
And so, but she's not, a progressive. Um, who you bring up in your article is Ezra Klein and Van Jones.
Right, and there was actually I had addressed a number of other Democratic Party figures in the original longer draft as well. But yeah, those were the ones who kind of made it into the final version. I had addressed Fetterman a little more as well, in addition to Gavin Newsom, of course.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah, and we should come around to them. But just on that point, I think your point is well taken in the sense that my article does sort of ultimately resolve things on the basis of a kind of Overton window framework. It's motivated, as you know, by these considerations about neoliberalism and post-neoliberalism. And actually, one of the small contributors to the piece is the fact that I'm currently doing a platypus mentorship with our German member, Fabian. And actually, something we read together, I told you about, is this book on the neoliberals,
Uh-huh.
published
Uh-huh.
in 1984, trying to think about how a kind of
Which is
insidious
about the Democrats, right?
about the Democrats,
Right. So in
exactly.
1984, a book about the neoliberals, and people should remember, or it's before their time, they should know that neoliberalism is a Democratic Party phenomenon. But go ahead.
Exactly. And right. And the book treats it very directly as such. And so that is certainly, and in fact, in my original draft, I even
Long
referenced
before Bill Clinton. Long before Bill Clinton.
Yes, it's actually precisely there that I referenced the book because Bill Clinton doesn't appear in the entire book, actually. And yet he becomes the ultimate expression of this phenomenon. And just as an aside, one of the fascinating things about the book is that it opens with a discussion of how essentially at first the phenomenon was denied. Like there were people who started to observe it, and I want to say this is like circa 1980, 1981, 1982. It's just denied. There are no new Democrats. There are no new neoliberals. Like nothing to see here. The party, everything is the same. And then once it's admitted, it kind of the phenomena reaches a kind of critical mass where it has to be acknowledged. Then it's condemned. And Arthur Schlesinger Jr. actually, who's I think thought of as like a spokesman for the older, like
Mm-hmm.
FDR, LBJ,
JFK, LBJ.
New Deal to
Yeah.
Great Society model of the party, basically says, well,
Huh?
these people are giving these Democrats, these new Democrats, they're conceding everything to Reaganism. So first it's denied, and then when it can no longer be denied, it's condemned. But as we
So just
know,
to put a finer point on it,
yeah,
terminologically, Reagan and Thatcher did not describe themselves as neoliberals. No.
right, right.
Right. So who were the neoliberals? They're the so-called New Democrats.
Yes, exactly,
Right.
exactly. And so, yeah, actually, I think my piece could have been strengthened if, you know, if I had simply, I frame it in terms of the two R's, resistance versus realignment. But I
Yep.
actually could have taken pains to point out that the realignment faction is essentially the post-neoliberal faction.
That's right. That's
Yeah,
right. No, it's a
yeah.
tricky thing because I think that the term is loaded and it's become synonymous with Reaganism and Thatcherism and Milton Friedman, etc. But also what people don't realize, and I know you've done work on this actually, in terms of the history of the Socialist Party,
Mhm.
the neocons of various varieties and the neoliberals, these are the defectors from the Democratic Party, meaning they are the discontents within the Democratic Party in the context of the crisis of the New Deal coalition in the 60s and 70s. Right. So the crisis of the FDR New Deal coalition, the realignment that went on back then in the 60s with respect to the South switching from Democrat to Republican, LBJ taking on board blacks as a constituency very deliberately, generates, as well as the Vietnam War and then the economic crisis of the 70s, generates these defections from the Democratic Party. And they're the neoconservatives and the neoliberals, but they all come from the Democratic Party.
Mhm.
And in some respects, you could talk about the shift starting in 1968 with Nixon, and in 1980, of course, it's more solidified with Reagan. That Nixon, what was Nixon? Wasn't he Eisenhower's vice president? Wasn't he essentially a New Dealer? And didn't he expand the Great Society after all? And aren't the deep roots of Reagan, in fact, in the New Deal Democratic Party?
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
And so the whole phenomenon, right, it's seen as like coming from outer space or something, it's like, I don't know, the Austrian, like Ordo liberals, the strange life form and Hayek and Friedman. But, Friedman would also fit the bill of a disgruntled Democrat, not a Republican.
Mhm. Right, right. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's maybe that's some of the thinking that I'm trying to sustain or push forward with the piece is thinking about politics. And again, in the Donald Trump May Die a Democrat article that may someday be written, that would be really front and center. But really, the thought experiment of thinking about all American politics essentially since the 1930s as fundamentally conditioned by the Democratic Party as
Yeah, the New
essentially,
Deal.
yeah,
The
yeah.
New Deal. That we're still dealing with the aftermath of the New Deal. And, if there was a crisis of the New Deal, that crisis is not merely to be understood in terms of the 70s downturn as an economic crisis. that brought on neoliberal economic policies in response, but is in fact a political crisis
Hmm.
of the Democratic Party as the ruling party.
Yeah.
Um, and I was also, I think that for our listeners, um, when dealing with like an Ezra Klein or a Van Jones or even, like a Gavin Newsom, that or thinking about the Clintons, Bill and Hillary Clinton, uh, that they are progressives, meaning they have this idea of a sort of steady progress with respect to policy and politics. And
Yes.
then they understand the Republicans as, uh, more or less loyal opposition, but, they need to be sort of contained. And then occasionally they win. It's like a hiccup on the road of progress,
Right.
right?
And at the level of political sociology, this gets to something you were discussing, I think, recently with the philosophy portal, Cadell Last,
Yep.
um, and something you lay out very well in your end of the Gilded Age piece, namely the politics of rising and falling classes in capitalism, or you might say, in the kind of in another way, sociologically, rising and falling societal groups or constituencies, right? And so the idea that when you discuss that progressive narrative that's shared by these Democratic Party figureheads and intellectuals, it's sort of the notion that they're the ascendant, or they're the coalition of the ascendant, or the coalition of the people on the up who are integrated and rising, and that the Republican Party then becomes the catch basin for the discontents of the left behind, the forgotten, who occasionally sort of, as you say, kind of freak out and turn to democratic politics in ways that are seen as like by the progressives as like harmful or dangerous. But ultimately, the ideal that both establishment Republicans and establishment Democrats share is that the discontents of the falling and fallen be contained. That that
Right. That's
the
right.
Republican Party becomes a safe container, a safety valve. It's a catch basin, but one that you don't let get set on fire or something. You make sure that things are sort of
That's
tamped
right. You
down.
don't turn it into a dumpster fire. That's right. So,
Yeah,
a couple of things come to mind. One is the infamous statement by Barack Obama about the people left behind clinging to their Bibles and their guns in response to being left behind. So
exactly.
that's the kind of latter phenomenon of that. I think that that's circa the 2012 election and running against Mitt Romney. And then also going all the way back to 1912, or really prior to 1912, actually, it's 1900, Eugene Debs. So before the New Deal realignment, when you had a quasi Republican Party takeover of the Democratic Party via progressivism, so a kind of an arc from Woodrow Wilson to FDR, but really FDR does represent something different from Woodrow Wilson, and he does come from the Roosevelt family who had been Republicans. That Debs, in his time, the Republicans were the progressives, and the
Right.
Democrats were the conservatives. And the way Debs, as a socialist, characterized these two parties, these two capitalist parties, was that the progress that the Republicans represented was just the triumphalism of capitalism, right?
Hmm.
Prosperity galore, give us 4 years more.
Right.
And whereas he called the Democrats the dying wailing of the middle class. So it's the wail and cry of the dying middle class. Uh,
Right.
and that's what their conservatism amounted to. It's also what their populism amounted to. So, insofar as in 1900, Debs was observing the absorption of populism into the Democratic Party, that populism, William Jennings Bryan, represented the dying middle class. Now, where did Debs come up with this idea? Marxism,
Right. Right.
right?
Right.
It's Marxism. And of course, the dying middle class can include the working class, insofar as the working class is not organized independently, but is by default a middle class,
So
right?
I have a question for you, because you raised this recently on Philosophy Portal with Cadell Est, the same interview that I just referenced. Do you think that in the kind of post neoliberal conditions, post neoliberal era, like insofar as the Democratic Party has become the party of the professional managerial class, do you think that post neoliberalism will be characterized by conditions that are worse and worsening for that class, such that the Democratic Party may actually reattain its character circa 1900 of capturing the discontents of a
Dying
once
middle class.
but dying, yeah, or do you think that's unlikely? How do you view that
No,
today?
it's a good question, right? So again, Hillary Clinton, the deplorables and the irredeemables, right? Meaning, yeah, these people who the National Review condemned in terms of voting for Trump in the primaries in 2016. I
Yes.
think they reviewed J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, and they said J.D. Vance describes very well these people who are really useless in society and who seems the only role that they serve is to vote for someone like Donald Trump, and we'd be happier if they all just died of overdoses.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Infamously, this was said in the National Review.
And I'll just add that when we went, you and I and others with Sublation, to Milwaukee for the RNC last year and attended
For
the
the film, the film The Last Election.
yes, and attended and filmed the and conducted interviews at the Never Trumper Republican Principles First kind of counter convention event. I described to you then the profound cynicism that they expressed, in the sense that they thought that they could just continue managing the Republican Party in such a way that this kind of populist grievance and discontent would always be captured and then muted and blunted and frustrated and never really taken seriously or given any kind of more authentic or powerful political expression. And so they were shocked when, essentially after doing this political maneuver that I just described for decades, the 90s, the 2000s, then suddenly it wasn't
That
enough.
it escaped.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that it
they
actually,
couldn't do it anymore. So it's Joe Walsh and
yes,
Charlie Sykes.
yeah, exactly. Who,
So yeah,
great, to their credit, some of the best interviews that we conducted for the entire documentary, because they were so candid politically about how they saw the role and function, and not simply saw, but how they executed the role and function of the Republican Party prior to Trump.
so the Trumpians, have complained about um, capture, political capture. And they've also complained about a kind of controlled opposition, that the Republicans are a controlled opposition and that they serve a function of political capture for the status quo. Now, this is the kind of thing that the left would have said about the Democratic Party all
Right.
not that long ago, that
Mm-hmm.
the nefarious character of the mainstream Democratic Party was that it was at best a captured opposition in the Bush years, let's say,
Yeah,
or in the
there's
Reagan years, right?
right. There's a Haymarket Press book, I think, by Lance Selfa, and this isn't unique to him, that characterizes the Democrats as the graveyard of social movements. I think that might be like a Mike Davis formulation, perhaps, as well. So, right, this idea that there's this discontent that then gets channeled into like a graveyard politically. Yeah.
Right. So this is the kind of complaint of an aspiring leadership of the party. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that we should be a real opposition, not a controlled opposition. And again,
Mm-hmm.
the question of the loyal opposition. So that way of characterizing it, loyal in what sense? Loyal to the bipartisan consensus. And the bipartisan consensus for a good long time was the New Deal. And
Right.
it the Democrats have always complained that somehow the Republicans were going to undo the New Deal, but somehow they never did. Right. So Nixon, the big threat of Nixon was that he'd undo the New Deal, and then of course Reagan, and that never happened. And so what happened instead was a modification of the New Deal. And but again, it's self-serving for the Democrats to describe that in terms of this progressive narrative as either advancing the New Deal or retreating on the New Deal, as opposed to a concrete reconfiguration of the New Deal,
Right.
right?
Right.
That is also progressive, right? So the question of progressive capitalism and the new needs of capitalism, meaning maybe the New Deal needs to be re-engineered to do what it did in the 30s and 40s, but under changed conditions in the 80s and 90s. And maybe
That's
now also.
yes, absolutely. Right, Trump as the true progressive of the
That's
moment,
right.
in the sense of politically taking responsibility for forging a new bipartisan consensus based on post-neoliberalism. Um, yeah.
Recently Trump has started to use this language, by the way, of
Okay.
he'd rather not call them liberals, he'd rather call them progressives. Uh,
Uh-huh.
oh, excuse me, it might be the opposite. He'd rather not call them progressives, but call them liberals because progressive sounds so beautiful and liberal sounds somewhat ugly. And
That's perfect.
it's a funny kind of like old-fashioned thing, meaning there was a time when the Democrats used to disavow being liberals.
Uh-huh.
And then they also disavowed being progressives. And now, of course, liberal is hardly ever used. Progressive has been embraced. Right. And I think that was in the Reagan era. There was this idea of like, we don't want to call ourselves, progressives. We don't want to call ourselves liberals. That these are sort of terms of abuse coming from the right.
I see. Uh-huh.
At the same time, even someone like Newt Gingrich said the Republicans were the true progressives. And that was in 1994. So that's a good 14 years into the Reagan Revolution era.
Hmm.
So I think that is important to keep in mind because resistance and realignment, uh, both sides will claim to still be progressive,
Yes. Yes.
won't they?
Right. Right. And they each have a plausible claim to that based on a certain historical understanding,
Hmm.
namely the kind of politics and policies that did in fact constitute capitalist state progressivism in the neoliberal era. Those are the purview of the resistance wing, and then what is needed to politically and societally undertake post neoliberalism, and that will be that's the progressivism associated with the realignment wing. Yeah.
Right. So it's I think that in a Gavin Newsom perspective, like in his discussion with Charlie Kirk, the idea that people went too far on the trans issue, right? So from this progressive narrative standpoint of the Democratic Party, the danger to the steady progress of history comes in two forms from within the Democratic Party. One form is going too fast, too far, too soon, too far, too fast. The other is losing faith, selling
Mm.
out, right?
Hmm.
Not maintaining, right? So you can err in the direction of the left, and you can err in the direction of the right. But if you avoid those two errors, then we can have this steady progress.
Right, and I suppose then the question is, what if the issue is not two dimensional but three dimensional? In other words, like what if there's an entirely different direction in
Yep.
which to go, and it's not about going in your existing direction either too fast or too slow, but it's actually about history demanding that a completely different direction be taken that would kind of sideline the render less significant the question of the prior destination. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it is remarkable that the Charlie Kirk assassination is understood by everyone to be a function of the culture wars, right? So, and how the culture war framework allows for certain things to remain silent or unstated, that this kind of question of, progressive reforms, progressive needs of capitalism, which can be then turned into like, oh, this is a way of avoiding the economy, avoiding economics, but it isn't as simple as that. Right. It's a matter of, okay, well, both sides of the culture war are wrong. And then who's responsible for the culture war? Who started the culture war? Who's guilty of taking it, you know, to the mat, if you will?
Right.
Whereas, we can all agree, you know, we can all agree on trans rights, but it should be for adults, not children.
Right.
Like a Charlie Kirk perspective, like what could he agree with Gavin Newsom on?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there was
Actually, quite a lot.
they could agree on quite a lot. And there was an article in the Atlantic over the summer, where liberals went wrong on gender medicine, ignoring the science, right?
Mhm.
And so it was like, okay, in this kind of culture war embattled condition, liberals ignored the science about youth gender medicine
Mhm. Mhm.
specifically, right? So
Mhm.
they didn't take heed to the British studies and the changes in policy in the UK
Right.
dictated by science,
Mhm.
right? So, and of course that masks a kind of political kind of bipartisan consensus. So there are all sorts of things that the parties agree on that they are going to agree on silently because it doesn't serve their interests to highlight these agreements, but rather to compete, to have their disagreements be the foot forward that they put.
Yeah.
There was one moment in the Charlie Kirk, Gavin Newsom discussion that I think you and I talked about that struck me, which is as they were kind of hashing out like the trans rights issue. Um, Charlie Kirk at one point said, well, you're bound to take that position, meaning, of course,
Mhm.
the two parties have to compete over the issue, and so therefore,
Uh-huh.
of
Uh-huh.
course, people have to take different sides of the issue. Otherwise, why do we have two parties? And so then it just became a matter of um, what's the basis on which we're agreeing to disagree? In
Mhm.
other words, what are
Mhm.
the bounds of our disagreement where we can say, okay, but you don't want to take it too far, right? But
Right.
where the two
Right.
parties are bound to represent the different sides.
Yeah, how are we going to slice up the sentiments of the electorate kind of predictably so that you get this piece and you guys get this piece and our side gets this other piece and we sort of agree to disagree in representing these positions that
Because
are
the parties have to represent, right? So the parties
right.
that represent these things must be represented. And so the question is, how do you represent it in such a
Yeah.
way as to not exaggerate the issue and touch off popular passions or fanaticism? And of course, that's really what happened here, right? Which is
Mhm.
to say
Right,
that
right.
clearly Charlie Kirk was seen as a existential threat
Yeah.
from a certain fanatical perspective.
Right, as representing hate that couldn't be negotiated out.
Right. Hate that cannot
Right.
be negotiated out. Exactly. Which again, there are all sorts of things. So the old Democratic Party, the old neoliberal Democratic Party that is
Mhm.
resisting the Trumpian changes. For instance, they say very directly, and I think we were talking about there was the Atlantic conference last week, and there was a panel discussion, and on this panel they had one black journalist, one guy, and I'm forgetting his name now, who said, I can't countenance someone like Charlie Kirk who would have wanted my family to be taken out of a restaurant by police. So the
Mm.
idea here being that because Charlie Kirk questions the civil rights acts of the 60s, that puts him outside the pale of acceptable politics. Well, perhaps not. Right. I think that Brianna Joy Gray also has this perspective that just questioning the civil rights legislation makes you a racist.
Right, and this really gets to debates that have been taking place on the right and among conservatives. I think about the distinction that the journalist Christopher Caldwell cites between ending Jim Crow on the one hand and then the Civil Rights Act and the kind of bureaucratic apparatuses it created on the other. And And then Richard Hanania has some overlap, but some critiques with his perspective. I think he thinks that Hanania seems to think that the act itself might be more salvageable, but it was sort of later legislative, regulatory, bureaucratic accretions on the basis of the original act that
Administrative interpretations, applications.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Like Obama's Title IX expansions.
Right. So there are a few distinctions one can draw, but that basic distinction between, the project of eliminating Jim Crow and legalized racial segregation, and then the Civil Rights Act on the other hand, like that's a distinction that, essentially the left is not
prepared
to countenance or to consider. Yeah.
That's right. Because it could very well be that measures that were taken in the 60s and 70s that were meant to be temporary,
Mm-hmm.
becoming a kind of institutionalized way of doing things in the neoliberal era, that
Right.
time has passed.
Right.
But again, that might be something that the parties have to silently agree on, especially in the face of things like Supreme Court decisions, overturning affirmative action in higher education, right? Where on the one hand, it's like, well, we'll continue to do it, we'll just call it something else, or it's actually abandoned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There was a debate between Curtis Yarvin and Danielle Allen at American Democracy at Harvard, or outside of Harvard, like in Boston or in Cambridge. And Yarvin tried to kind of pigeonhole Danielle Allen, because she's a black woman, and say, well, you must support affirmative action. And she said, actually, I don't.
Right.
She said we should have really class-based, not race-based affirmative action.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really threw him for a loop, because actually he was forced to agree. He was forced to agree.
Right.
And so ultimately, Curtis Yarvin, like anarchist, no, he's just a New Deal progressive liberal Democrat at the end of the day, right? You scratch the surface of this, alt-right reactionary. And in fact, no, he just wants a rejigging of what is essentially agreed upon, which is a progressive liberal capitalist state management.
Right. It's and also just better Burnhamism, right? Like better elite circulation.
Sure.
Maybe you get the best and brightest of the inevitable elite more effectively if you do affirmative action based on class. Sure. Yeah.
That's right. Exactly. That meritocracy, at the end of the day, meritocracy does have to be government engineered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the only question is how. And indeed, hell, class-based system might help black people more than a race-based system, right?
Of course, yeah.
Which was also implicit for both of them.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm. Yeah. Right.
And so lo and behold, they agree on the goal. They not only agree on the means, but also on the ends.
Yeah.
And this huge culture war difference amounts to nothing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yet, obviously, it does amount to something, at least ideologically, in the sense that it can rile people up and they can end up killing each other.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and I'm not sure if pieces like mine have any effect on the world. I'm almost certain that they don't. But I was sort of motivated at that basic level by my own recollection of being a sort of young radicalized person and trying to make sense of what is to be done, and considering sometimes, never violence in my case, but sometimes quite extreme and life-altering courses of action on the basis of the ideology that I had come to believe. And so, yes, I was sort of thinking about that, and in the tragedy of it, in the sense of the historical lag, to sort of jump to the closing paragraph of my article, that that maybe the most tragic element might be that in 10 or 15 years, people who take this ideology, this sort of Trump is Hitler or fascist, and and the Democratic Party must resist at all costs. Like this kind of ostensibly progressive or ostensibly radical ideology. This could have a very long tail in the hearts and minds of certain people of all ages, young and even older, and there may come a point when the Democratic Party essentially moves away from it, and many of these people will accordingly follow their party in doing so as well, and actually some will not.
I mean, you bring up the 70s and the days of rage, um, and I don't know whether you invoked the Weather Underground per se, but of course we know infamously that Bill Ayers was one of the patrons of Obama's early political career,
Right,
and that is not evidence of Obama's radicalism, but rather the opposite. It's evidence that Bill Ayers was always just a Democrat
right, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
and remains so,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So, he's, I guess, in his 80s now. Did he say at the Platypus convention? He's quite old, and yet he's very, yes, because he had his 80th birthday celebration, and he was happy that most of the people there were under 35.
Mm-hmm.
And so, he's happy to continue to enlist, unwary youth to become the shock troops for the Democrats, as he
Right.
has always done since he himself was one of those shock troops.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Um, yeah. In an earlier version of the article, I sort of ended simply with the question of, is the Democratic Party worth killing and dying for? But I figured that the editors
That's your last line now.
yes,
That is your
but
last line now. But would you
specify the
rather say the Democrat resistance wing?
yeah, it's resistance wing because that does specify it. But I think for us as Marxists and would be proletarian socialists, it's we kind of zoom out and look at it as simply the Democratic Party as such. Like, are you willing to kill and
Yes.
die for this party and its ideology? And do you realize that that's what you're doing? Do you realize that that's what you're doing? Because you may or may not agree with us, but from our point of view, that's actually all you're doing. And so maybe
Indeed, and you could easily say that they're killing and dying for the realignment wing, not for the resistance wing. In other words, that the Charlie Kirk assassination might not have stalled, but might accelerate the realignment.
that's true. Yeah, that's true. Right, and that's what I point to. And actually, I'd like to hear your thoughts more on how you think that is. But the way I pointed to that in the article is to say that in the Trump administration's response, there's focus on how this is hurting Democrats, right? And so again, a kind of at first glance, it looks like it's just the familiar cross-partisan civil war, like woke Democrats versus woke resistance Democrats versus Trump MAGA Republicans. Okay, but actually the Trump supporters, I could say at least, are making these distinctions among Democrats, and they're saying, well, there are these certain networks that fund and support and organize for certain dimensions of the party, but not others, and we need to punish those. But by implication, like, they're not destroying the Democratic Party, and
They
so
are not. They're propping it
so
up, saving it.
exactly. So it's going to elevate others, and then they're even saying that actually Trump should be going out of his way to elevate and amplify and support the voices in the Democratic Party that are
Well, we know on the other side, the Democrats for a long time have been saying that the Democrats, need to save the Republican Party against Trumpism.
right, exactly. And they did this for 10 years. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And we were, again, we were there at Principles First in Milwaukee last year at the
And they
GOP.
did endorse the Democrats.
They did endorse, after after saying basically, well, we tried to sabotage and stop Trump within our own party for essentially a
And
decade,
now we
and
need outside help.
yeah, yeah,
Now we
exactly.
need
Now we
outside help. No, I mean, this is a very old phenomenon now, an antiquated phenomenon, but I'm aware of the Green Party in the United States and the role that it played. So it self-consciously played the role of spoiler, meaning they were hoping to siphon off votes to cause the Democrats to lose, to punish the Democrats, but it was in order to effect reform in the Democrats. In other words, you punish them for going too far right in order to force them to go further left so that they can recapture the votes that the Greens got.
Mhm.
And that's basically the idea. The idea is that the old style Republicans, the principles first and bulwark Republicans, want to see the Republicans lose so that they can be forced to abandon Trumpism,
Right, of course.
right? And so, in this respect, within the Democratic Party, certainly the progressive wing would probably be happy to see right-wing Democrats lose in order to
Oh yeah.
further their agenda within the party. And similarly, the more centrist Democrats would like to see the more extreme progressives lose in order to further their agenda. So
Mhm.
it's a curious dynamic. And again, what if it's not just going further left or further right? What if it's not two-dimensional? What if it is three-dimensional?
Right,
In which
right.
case, we're really talking about a transformation of the center. And
Yeah.
that's maybe, we can end on this note, which is, because you started with this idea of an article that you originally thought of writing, but didn't write. You wrote this, Charlie Kirk and the New Civil War, instead, um, that Trump is not extreme right. Trump doesn't represent the extreme right taking over the Republican Party at all, but he
Right.
represents a kind of centrism. And that's why, he has to keep a certain distance from Steve Bannon and others. Like, however one wants to characterize the extreme right wing of the party, it could be Elon Musk even, right?
Hmm.
You could say Steve Bannon and Elon Musk, who might disagree with each other, are both nonetheless in their different ways too right wing for Trump. And that what Trump is ultimately trying to do is affect the bipartisan consensus, and perhaps in ways that are not acknowledged. So one thing that in the earlier discussion that occurred to me was, is Gavin Newsom against the tariffs? Probably not.
Mm.
Probably not.
Interesting.
Or Ezra Klein, for that matter. Meaning they might quibble over the tactical considerations of the tariffs, but are they really going to be against tariffs? They might say, well, it can't make up for the tax cuts. It shouldn't be directed so much at our allies as a geopolitical tool. But ultimately, the principled opposition to the tariffs has pretty much vanished.
Hmm. Hmm.
Meaning, the only criticisms of Trump's tariffs that remain are tactical.
Right, right, right.
They're not really strategic or principled. But they're merely tactical. It's merely about the implementation. There might be some skepticism, but Trump is, the priorities of his administration are to change things in such a way as to affect the silently agreed upon bipartisan consensus.
Hmm.
And is
Hmm.
that right wing? Is it left wing? Is it conservative? Is it progressive? you know, uh, Tariffs were associated with progressivism at one point in history, and then they were seen as reactionary at another point in history. Like tariffs themselves have a varying character of, are these a progressive measure, but like the wrong kind of progressivism, or are they a reactionary measure, or maybe they're a conservative measure, but the wrong kind of conservative measure, etc.
Right. And the real question is, that determines whether or not they would have a progressive character, but then also determines the bounds of a reconstituted bipartisan centrism would be whether and how they factor into the imperatives of growth and capital accumulation under post-neoliberal rather than neoliberal conditions.
Yeah. Meaning maybe you get rid of tariffs for neoliberalism, but maybe you bring them back for post-neoliberalism. And after all, Bernie Sanders, who represents the potential realignment, but on the Democratic Party side, right? He would not have been a free trader ever,
right,
any
right, right,
more than he was relatedly ever for open,
open,
unlimited immigration.
right, exactly,
Right.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
the thing is that it's not as if, open immigration versus restricted immigration or tariffs, free trade, protectionism, etc. These are not things that are adjudicated as either clearly progressive or conservative.
Right, right, right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead, the culture war takes the place, and it's like, oh, say what you will about immigration policy, but aren't you just a racist?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I see what you mean. Right.
Right.
Whereas like the actual centrism is playing out with respect to for
These
example,
policies are going to be changed.
yeah.
They're going to be changed. The wall will be there. The
Hmm.
border measures will be there. The new situation of limited illegal crossings will be there, right? And, Biden tried to undo the first Trump policies. It didn't work out. Are the Democrats really going to do that again? No, they're probably not. And so it's just, again, a lot of this shift to post neoliberalism has happened, will happen, not to be reversed, right?
Right,
We're not going
right,
back. We're not going back.
right.
And so that's where this kind of Overton window idea of, left and right and extremism and bipartisan consensus versus extreme partisan polarization doesn't really describe what's actually going on.
Uh-huh. Right, right, right. Right, because it's not accounting for the kind of forward movement of history against which resistance is futile. Uh,
Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, I mentioned Danielle Allen being against affirmative action on racial grounds, but being in favor of it on class grounds. Does that make her a MAGA Republican? No, of course not. She's still a
Right.
progressive Democrat.
Yeah, exactly. It might make her a progressive Democrat more attuned to the needs of a
The new
post-neo.
style.
Yeah,
Is
exactly.
she a DSAer? She's not a DSAer either, right? So what is
Right,
she, right? She's not a socialist, right? She's saying class-based affirmative action. Is that socialism? No,
right,
it's
right,
capitalism.
right. I'll just close on two ideas, and then maybe invite if you have any closing words, and we can go over to the parrot room. But it occurs to me that probably somewhere in my mind, unconsciously, was this book that I read some of, and I think we discussed maybe some years ago now, titled "Indispensable Enemies" by Walter Karp, and
That's
it's
right.
it's quite an idiosyncratic book, and I'm not sure whether how or whether some of its specific sort of historical theses and interpretations play out, but I think the basic premise is that parties should be seen not as simply counterposed to each other, but actually as propping each other up, and in particular that each party is characterized by an establishment wing and a dissident wing, and that whenever historically actually unite in combating the dissident wing that's arising within one of the parties, and this
Within one of the parties.
exactly.
Mhm.
And this seemed to, in very generic terms, this did seem to
Meaning
sort
Nixon and the Democrats united to keep the George Wallace down, or to keep extreme like Goldwaterism down, or to
of
keep,
right.
at that point, Reaganism down in '68
Yes,
and
yes,
'72.
and more recently, the Never Trumpers aligned with the establishment Democrats to try to keep Trump down.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm not sure how, if the Democrats are in a period of post neoliberal realignment, I'm not exactly sure if the analogy that I'm drawing holds to what's about to happen, but it involves some of the same thinking in the sense that, what would it look like for the now dominant Trump wing of the GOP to prop up a now dissident minority, but arguably, emerging realignment wing within the Democrats.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a funny thing because when you say that, and again, I wrote an article for Compact, my most recent article for Compact on Musk and Trump was, I was being very deliberately skeptical that there is a MAGA wing,
mm,
meaning Steve Bannon says that there's a MAGA wing, but that doesn't mean that there really is. And
okay.
even if there is, Trump himself may not be a member of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because what would that wing be? Would it be Ramaswamy? Would it be Vance? Who would it be?
Right,
Right?
right.
True MAGA. True MAGA. Who's that?
Yeah,
Maybe Trump himself doesn't fit.
I guess I was using it to mean everyone except the Never Trumpers.
Well,
But
they're
I'm
out
not sure.
already. They're gone.
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Never Trumpers are gone. And yet it's not as if the Republican Party isn't still divided.
That's true. That's true.
Right? And
And
without Trump, there would be no basis for unity, really.
right. And that may be, I don't know how much I sort of am wedded in my piece to the claim that I just made. But I see your point that there actually may be limitations, to the extent to which the Republican Party will play that role in affecting change within the Democratic Party. Yeah, there might not be a politics within the Republican Party that's quite strong
That's
or
quite
unified.
capable of doing that. Laura
Yeah,
Ingraham, on Fox News, she has said, and Steve Bannon more recently has tried to say that the left and right populists should unite against the establishment,
right, right, right.
right? And so I think soon after the 2018 election, Laura Ingraham even said, you know, AOC should find common ground with Trump
Hmm. Hmm.
against like neoliberalism,
Right.
right? So I think that is no longer the way people are talking. So that's first term Trump. And what I'd say, maybe we'll end on this. I'll and tease the parrot room discussion a
Yeah.
little bit, which will be on my tweet, my post. They are killing each other.
Yeah.
Which is, it's not about sympathy, right? For these things, it's like sympathy for Trump or sympathy for the alignment Democrats or what have you. It really can't be about that. Meaning, should we welcome a successful realignment of the Democratic Party or not? In
Right.
any, in the same way of, welcoming Trump or not. Well, no. I mean, at a certain point, it seemed like Trump was going to happen. And so the question is, how do we deal with it and how do we not deny it? Like, not deny
Right.
the reality of it, deal with it for what it actually is, rather than characterizing it inaccurately or simply falsely and in a self-serving way. Because I think that, you mentioned Wyatt
Hmm.
and, Wyatt identifying as a Democrat. Well, there is a question of whether people who got on board with Trump at various moments, whether they were really getting on board with Trump or just their fantasy of Trump.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
Which he himself might have played into, but if you paid attention closely, it's like, but Trump never actually represented that, whatever you
And
thought it was.
as you just mentioned, of Musk and Bannon, and yeah, and I'm sure this applies to the Groypers, and yeah, a lot of different people who claim Trump or see him as somehow representing them, but the reverse does not apply.
That's right. And
At least not beyond like a kind of mere political transaction of support and
that's
sympathy.
right. That's right. And the news of the day in the last, like, I don't know, 24, 48 hours is that Trump is switching sides again on the Russia-Ukraine war. Again, we can
Yeah.
talk about this in the second half, meaning
Mhm.
he was seen as implicitly pro-Putin, pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine, but now he's telling NATO to shoot down Russian planes, and he's saying that Ukraine can plausibly, militarily prevail over Russia and recapture all lost territory.
Mhm.
So has he switched sides? Has he betrayed MAGA? No, of course not. Because what did people think he represented? He's neither side,
Right.
and neither should we be.
Right. 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 And
It's the lesson.
so,
The lesson is, don't be fooled into these false polarizations.
right. And that, if I do have a question for you, do you think the sort of thesis of my piece is right, that in the next 10, 15 years, the Democrats will realign? I want to know if you think that's true or likely to happen. But I guess, in keeping with what you said, my sense is if that is happening very slowly, there could be two reactions to it. One is to simply get on board with it. And then the other reaction is sort of to decry it as like a betrayal. And I think that the left itself will be divided by those two.
We'll be divided. That's right. I mean, look, if we were to go to Westchester County and sit down for wine and cheese with Bill and Hillary Clinton, and we just put it to them point blank, at what point did you go from being McGovern Democrats to becoming Reaganites? They would say we never did become Reaganites,
Right, right.
right? And maybe if we got them drunk enough, they would admit that they never ceased being McGovernite Democrats, but they would say that was misunderstood.
Right.
McGovernism was not this crazy left-wing thing that others have characterized it as. It was like reasonable progressivism of its time, and we fulfilled that. Right, but we never gave in to Reaganism. No, of course not. We fought it. We always fought it, and we
And this,
continue to fight it.
right.
So it will
And if
never
I
be acknowledged. The realignment will never be acknowledged.
Exactly right. And this gets to the point you've made in on Trump, which is that Trump has the virtue of sort of explicitly drawing these distinctions and making the politics clear, whereas the Democrats characteristically obscure the politics.
But also to themselves. In other words, when I say that they would never acknowledge it, neither to themselves.
Yeah.
Right? It's not that they wouldn't acknowledge it to us or to anyone else. It's that they can't acknowledge it to themselves because in a true sense it never happened.
Mm,
In a
yeah.
true sense it never happened. Meaning there's a kernel of truth to Benjamin Studebaker saying, neoliberalism is just everything post World War II. And the so-called neoliberal turn of Reagan and Thatcher never really happened. It's all been the same. There is a kernel of truth to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so let's end this half, and I'll see you on the other side.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Sounds good.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.